evening, everybody. Thanks. It's really nice to see you. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night to come see our program this evening. My name is Lauren Silver, and I am the Vice President for Education at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. And we're just really thrilled to see you all here tonight. We have a small group, so it'll be a really nice conversation, and it feels kind of warm and intimate. So it's very nice to see everybody here. For those of you who don't know, this is the 7th program in our ongoing series of, in our ongoing Creating Citizens speaker series here at UC Berkeley. This is a series of student-led and student-produced programs inviting a wide range of speakers, community and campus leaders to come in and have conversations about the civic and social issues of our time. This is also a series that was founded by students, so we're really, really proud of this. And we're very proud to partner with the ASUC Vote Coalition, which is part of the External Affairs Vice President's Office. It's a mouthful. And to have received support and collaboration and co-sponsorship from the Mario Savio Social Justice Program, which is part of the Public Service Center here on campus. Is anybody not familiar with Commonwealth Club World Affairs? Okay, a few of you. Good. That's no shame. That's why I asked. So Commonwealth Club World Affairs is the oldest and largest nonpartisan public affairs forum in the U.S. We were founded in 1903. We are located on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And every year we offer hundreds of programs, literally hundreds, on a wide range of topics from politics to education, climate to social justice, entertainment, culture, and more with global, local, and national leaders. We invite everybody to please join us. Creating Citizens is our civics education initiative. And sorry, I lost track of my notes. We build on the Commonwealth Club World Affairs foundational values of civility, mutual respect across divides, and informed civic action to bring youth and adults together to bridge divides of age, political persuasion, background, gender, all kinds of divides, so that we can all work together to support and continue building our shared democracy. There's lots of ways for you to get involved and to learn more if anybody here is interested. We offer free tickets and discounted memberships to Commonwealth Club World Affairs for educators and students. We have a variety of school programs. If anybody in here is an educator or knows educators, great programs. We have a youth advisory committee. We offer intergenerational dialogues, which are fantastic programs. And we have an annual college internship. So for those of you who are Cal students, that may be something you want to pay attention to. We have a number of staff members here tonight from Creating Citizens. And if there's anything that you want to know more about, please just find one of us and ask us. Or you can visit our website, which is commonwealthclub.org/education. So a couple of reminders for everybody before we get started. We are recording this program for both video and audio. If you have any devices, watches, phones, anything that you think might make noise, might beep, might ring, that might affect the sound recording, please do silence them, or if you want to turn them completely off, you are invited to do so. We also encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. We will have a Q&A period, and you can do that by grabbing a card that was either on or near the seats when you came in, and hold up your card, and somebody will come and collect it from you. Please write clearly, otherwise we won't be able to ask it. So now I'm very happy to introduce Kylie Wallace, who is the student lead for tonight's program. Kylie is a senior here at Cal, studying political science and media studies. She's passionate about promoting civic engagement among youth and young adults. She serves as the director of programs for the ASUC Vote Coalition in the Office of External Affairs, of the External Affairs Vice President. And she's also a campus ambassador for the Andrew Goodman Foundation, which is an independent nonprofit that works to make young voices and votes a powerful force for democracy. It has been an honor and a joy to work with Kylie this semester on this program, so please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to Creating Citizens and the Commonwealth Club World Affairs for your partnership on today's program. I also want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Mario Savio Social Justice Program at the Public Service Center, and especially Dr. Sandra Bass for making this event possible. My name is Kylie Wallace, and I'm the Programs Director for VoteCo here at Berkeley. And we are so grateful to the Commonwealth Club and their ongoing commitment to uplifting youth and student voices and working to expand civic participation on and beyond campus. What started as a student-led effort to spark conversations beyond the classroom has evolved into a vibrant series that brings together students, scholars, and practitioners alike committed to redefining civic engagement for our generation. Creating Citizens events serve as proof that student voices can drive meaningful public discourse. Tonight's conversation invites us to confront a central paradox. Even as young people consistently express deep concern for social and political issues, they remain among the most underrepresented groups in the electorate. We'll explore why so many turn away from traditional political channels, systemic barriers, and importantly, how they sustain civic life through new forms of participation, from mutual aid networks to campus resource sharing, community coalitions, and social justice. In an era of polarization and institutional strain, young people are reshaping the meaning of civic engagement. In a moment when the systems around us often feel unresponsive, or our generation continues to find ways to act, organize, and imagine differently. This event invites us to think expansively about how higher education and local communities can nurture civic responsibility, even when public institutions fall short. Together, we'll consider how solidarity itself can serve as infrastructure and how relationships, shared responsibility, and collective creativity can help sustain democratic life. Our moderator for this conversation is Nathan Long. He's from the Berkeley Forum, and he'll be joined by a panel of speakers whose experiences reflect the many ways that civic life takes shape today, from organizing on campus to building coalitions across communities. At this time, I'd love to welcome Nathan and our speakers.
Thank you, Kylie. As she mentioned, my name is Nathan Long, and I will be facilitating tonight's conversation. Tonight's conversation centers around civic engagement in our current generation. What does democratic participation look like outside of traditional government-backed channels, and how do both these alternative and traditional approaches lend to civic life today? I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Dr. Mindy Romero is the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, which is part of the USC's Sol Price School of Public Policy. She's a political sociologist holding a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on political behavior and race and ethnicity, seeking to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the US. Sehena Johannes is a high school senior in the San Leandro Social Justice Academy, the anti-corporate extraction lead for Youth versus Apocalypse, and Oakland's Vice Youth Poet Laureate. She's a dedicated Bay Area youth activist with experience in ethnic studies education and organizing, with a passion for sharing her knowledge with others. Ashley Kelly is a supervisor of fellow learning and engagement at College Corps and is part of the UC Berkeley Public Service Center. With over a decade of social justice work, she's an experiential educator, facilitator, coach, and healing justice practitioner, working with various organizations, collectives, and communities. As mentioned before, we do have an audience Q&A at the end, so please fill out those question cards and we will take your questions at the end. So with that said, I'd like to welcome our speakers to the panel tonight. I wanted to start this conversation by asking each of you about your experiences with civic infrastructure and where it might be falling short for young people today. So Dr. Romero, as a founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, formerly known as the California Civic Engagement Project, where do you see civic infrastructure falling short when it comes to our current generation?
Thanks for having me. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, great. Oh, That's a big question, right? I'd say overall, we're not doing very well when it comes to civic infrastructure, and really young people generally are left to alternative or more creative ways to get engaged or to push through the barriers that are already in place. So we can think about kind of traditional political forms of engagement like voting, which is where we have most of the data. And we can think about civic engagement in more the traditional kind of known common ways that we measure it kind of forums. So like being part of clubs or agitating or at least engaging with your board of supervisors or your city council. That was a phrase I was looking for. And then there's everyday forms of civic engagement that I think young people are actually participating in quite significantly, but they define what is important to them, what they consider to be engagement, and the outcomes that they think actually matter. And what we often do in the larger kind of research that's done around engagement, especially for young people, is we tend to define and limit what we think engagement is. And what it does is really disproportionately disadvantage young people in particular, because we only recognize what we measure, and what we measure is what we say is legitimate. And so where more traditional forms like voting, right, or engaging with your city council, yes, it's true that young people do participate at much lower rates. There's real reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll get into today. It's not that young people don't care or that they're apathetic. That's very important. But the other ways that young people do find make a difference, that matter for them, the ways that they think are actually actionable on the issues that they care about. Like these are the pathways, right? We tend not to recognize them, which means we tend not to support them, and the policies and resources and funding and all those sorts of things often don't come to those other forms of engagement, which again then leave young people to, and sometimes they're okay with that, not to get the involvement. But overall, it's not a good thing, right, to not be supporting and recognizing the forms of engagement that are important to young people, because you want to be able to help increase that and also transition it into other forms of more traditional kind of power pathways. Not that one's more important than the other, but hopefully bring it all together into kind of a multi-pronged approach for youth voice and youth recognition and representation and power. So that's one thing I would say about, to answer your question. We aren't doing a very good job of it, and that's one of the ways that we're not doing a good job of it, is that we just don't recognize and don't see as legitimate often the important types of engagement that are there and that are present for young people.
Yeah, and Sehena, I wanted to ask you about these types of engagements that are maybe alternative and not the ones that Dr. Romero said that are currently measured. In your time at Youth versus Apocalypse and doing youth advocacy in general, what has been your experience with cultivating civic engagement in non-government and maybe alternative institutions?
Okay, well, hi. As a part of this generation that's too young to vote, I'm only 16, kind of what Dr. Romero was saying, Mindy, kind of what Mindy was saying about finding alternative ways. I found that we've kind of really had to create our own paths in our own ways. I feel like the biggest thing for me and the groups I surround myself with, like Youth versus the Apocalypse or the Social Justice Academy at San Leandro, it's really a lot of educating our peers. I feel like one of the main barriers between young people like high school age and below and fully participating in civic engagement can usually be education. Now that social media is kind of such a big part of education for the young people, it's really kind of like important to bring that education to them in person, because you never know what a person's algorithm could be. Some people just genuinely don't get news on their algorithms and For You pages. And so to have these clubs at schools or outside of schools having political homes for youth, like Youth versus Apocalypse, that's incredibly important. That's how I found my start with activism. I feel like the most important part for me has been having spaces like this at school. Obviously, every youth has different lives outside of schools. Not everyone can go to like meetings after school or rallies or actions. So sometimes having it in places where it's the most accessible can be the key to giving a young person their start in social justice or in civic engagement. But yeah, that's what I got.
Awesome. And then Ashley, I wanted to ask you, with your experiences in social work and education, how do you see people typically engage with their communities today?
To see people typically engage? In so many ways. I could say like kind of broadly and then think about it in the context of my job. So broadly, I think people are out in all sorts of interesting spaces socially, and I live in Oakland. There was sort of an interesting resurgence of like third space places to socialize of late. So like places you can just listen to music and chat with people, which suggests to me that folks are sick of what's happening on the internet and want to like connect and know folks. So there's sort of like just socially like wanting to be amongst other people, listening to music, going out to dinner, parties, community events, book talks, there's all sorts of different ways, and then those things can sort of lead itself to a certain kind of conversation. At least the places I tend to spend my time, I find, we're here listening to an album about D'Angelo and his recent passing, which then sort of leads to a much longer conversation and analysis, right, of anti-Blackness and the media and who gets platformed and why. And so there's sort of this interesting just like bubbling all the time that can be sort of one pathway to start moving folks. But then the next question for me is like, okay, great, we're gathering the people parts there, but then what does it mean for us to move, right? What is sort of the next space for us to be engaging with our community? What does it take for that interesting conversation to then be met with a praxis and volunteering? And mutual aid projects. I have some of my favorite collaborators are in the room. So I think that there are many places and ways that folks are engaging, and what volunteering, engagement, connection looks like is really different. So it's as simple as I feel grateful to know a lot of people who are really spending time knowing their neighbors as much as they are out doing more traditional things like knocking on doors or soup kitchens and stuff.
Yeah, great. So with all these different experiences, I wanted to ask, what gaps do you see in more traditional forms of civic engagement, such as electoral politics or government-backed programs? And how are these gaps being fulfilled by alternative forms of democratic participation, such as mutual aid networks, community coalitions, or just peer-led initiatives? Yeah, and I'll just leave it on the table if anyone had strong comments.
Either. I'll give that one first. Anyone start? You want me to start? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about voting, right? As I think most people, when we think about traditional forms of engagement, we think political and we think voting. Again, the kind of the number one way we measure it, at least for sure. So in any given election, whether it's a presidential, midterm, primary, general, turnout for young people, let's just say 18 to 24-year-olds, right? Not that defines totally who young people are, but that's like the when we usually define or measure kind of turnout, and we're looking at trying to understand older versus younger voters, we're looking at that group. Turnout is much lower for those that are 18 to 24 versus the general population, and much lower, 20, 30, 40 percentage points lower than those that are 65 plus. And whatever the election is, whether it's a high turnout year or whatever type of election it is, we know there's going to be significant gaps. And I think some of the gaps have narrowed, depending on how you want to look at it, and the type of election, have narrowed a little bit in the last 15 years, which I find exciting, but it's just a little bit. And the story is always significant gaps, and I'm happy to talk about why there has been some narrowing. But generally, that's the story. And the reason, as I hinted out earlier, it's not because young people are apathetic, right? I don't need to tell a young person that's here, or all of you that are here that will fall into that category. There are very real barriers still at play. And California has actually been ahead of the rest of the nation in many ways in terms of the last 15 years or so, implementing a lot of election reforms, many of which have been geared specifically to try to minimize gaps, including for young versus old. And some of that I think has helped. But we still, I think for the most part, the story, it perpetuates itself because even with some of those reforms, we know that young people are left out of the political process. So in our nation, in our electoral or democratic system, it's campaigns and candidates that do the overwhelming majority of the outreach and voter mobilization. So we can try to change and open up access to and make registration easier for young people, which we have. We still have a ways to go, I think, too, there. A lot of institutional reforms, policy, how we run elections. We've done a lot there to make it easier for young people. Again, still overall a ways to go. But the kind of motivational, kind of the other side of the barriers, making young people want to participate, is still an egg we haven't cracked. And I never use that term. For some reason that popped in my head right now. And it's some people, or actually a lot of people, including media, will say that it's got to be because young people don't care or that they're apathetic. And what it is, I think a lot of it is that young people turn 18, we don't give them much support in schools. There's always the wonderful teacher or the principal that wants to go above and beyond with civics, right, or creative programs. But overall, you turn 18 in the United States or in California, you don't get much support civically, you don't get the how, what, the full how, what, and why voting is important. And when you turn 18, we magically expect you to know how to vote, right? Not just how, right, but want to vote, feel like it matters. And when you don't vote, when numbers are lower, young people do vote, but when numbers are lower, our society blames young people for it. And we say, what's wrong with these kids today? And oh, well, maybe it's not. And a lot of that really serves just to actually justify. The apathy narrative is a way to justify not investing and not doing the full set of reforms that we need. And so I mentioned the kind of motivational aspect. One part of it is that as the way our political system is structured, campaigns and candidates do the overwhelming majority of the outreach. They're not reaching young people. They're using likely voter models, right? Targeting based on data. And because of the historic kind of disparities, they typically leave young people, even those that are registered to vote, even sometimes those that have voted even once before, out of their modeling, out of their outreach efforts. And if you're a young person in the United States today, even if you're registered, you are much less likely to get the mails, the texts, the social media contact, all those things that do still matter. You're not getting the civics in the same ways, right? And you're not getting the outreach from campaigns and candidates. And then, of course, the issues that are spoken. There's a lot of overlap between old and young. We know this from survey data. But there's also issues that young people prioritize differently than older voters. And you're going to see in debates and in messaging, if it reaches a young person, they're going to get messaging that's going to be about Medicare and Social Security and less about issues that they care about. And so I think young people often don't feel like voting or those traditional forms are actionable steps so they care, they want to make a difference, they want to affect change on the issues that matter to them or help their communities, but they don't see why voting is actually that step. And it's quite rational. It's not apathy, right? The apathy narrative is really about really suppressing or discouraging young people from voting. So it's the data tell us the disparities are significant and the story continues, but the common narrative that we see is actually just a way to serve to justify that. And we still need to work on the institutional barriers, and we need to also really change overall our system and how it engages and actually doesn't engage with young people. That makes it quite rational why they don't often participate. Young people should participate, but the decision, the calculation is often quite rational.
And then
that was a long answer.
No problem, it's good. And speaking of which, Ashley, I wanted to ask you from maybe the student side with working with students who may be more civically disengaged, what are some bottlenecks that they feel are holding them back?
That's a good question. I think your average Cal student is so busy. I am often just like, sometimes I look at my students' calendars and I'm just like, how are you all functioning? So there's that piece, right? You come here to get one type of education, and then there's also so much. And then the students I typically work with in College Corps, many of them are first generation, many of them are low income students. So not only are they going to school full time, they're working, they're sending money back home, they're taking care of their families. And then also committing to doing these extra things, right? That are very close to their hearts, are often issues that are, very much affecting them in real-time ways. And so I think that the real challenge is like a meaningful systemic barrier of how do I come to school, get the degree that I know I want to get to move forward in life and often take care of my family, while also doing these things I care about. And I will say I don't have a clear answer of how that translates to voting, but as far as the type of engagement we do at the Public Service Center, our students are working incredibly hard and still showing up, and and then sometimes a student will disappear for several months, and I know it's because they're holding so much. So I think there's just sort of a meaningful, I think I often ask myself at this many years in higher ed of what's higher ed for again? I kind of sometimes lose which things should I push the students to? Is it to show up, you made a commitment, or is it actually I think you should go to class today instead and work on your study? So I think there's just a real, I think it's really tough to go to school and have any sort of financial need.
And so that keeps students mostly disengaged.
I think so.
It's a big barrier. And then Sahenna, for students who maybe are not of voting age, how do you keep them civically engaged? Are there any barriers to civic engagement?
Definitely. I go to a school that is predominantly Black and brown youth, And as someone that grew up in a Black and brown household, I feel like one of the things I've grown up hearing from relatives is, I'm not voting this year. I think that growing up hearing that is automatically kind of a barrier in itself. And it's not the adult's fault who's saying that, it's the system that's telling them that their vote doesn't count. I feel like throughout history and in the present time, Black and brown people are consistently made to feel like their vote doesn't matter as much. And especially Black and brown youth, like that's kind of just a double whammy, you know? We're not of that age yet. And I feel like we're not really taken seriously necessarily when it comes to civic engagement. You could even look at the way that politics, if it is advertised to us, the ways it is advertised to us. I feel like you can look at social media accounts and see how a lot of the posts are almost like jokes, you know? And it's never like that for any of the older generations. And I feel like that in itself, whether it's intentional or unintentional, that in itself can be a barrier, and it can undermine the seriousness of voting and civic engagement in general. And kind of the way I find is best to introduce other youth to civic engagement is to show them how important it is to me and how important it is to my peers. I kind of feel like there's almost a hero syndrome about everybody sometimes, you know, that we expect that someone else is going to do all the work for us about issues we care about. And kind of to really add to Mindy's point, that we're not apathetic. It's not that we don't care. Everyone has an issue they care about, whether it's due to a personal reason, a family member, or you know, maybe they are just a little bit more ahead of the game when it comes to civic engagement. But just kind of showing people that you can be the change. Like, you can be the first person in your community to say, hey, I don't like that. I'm going to work to make a change. Kind of being that first person when it comes to the issues you care about can be such a big motivator to people. I've heard that so much in regards to the academy I'm a part of at school. And how when we speak out about things, it makes others who maybe are more shy or are just not as involved, it makes them want to become more involved. So kind of leading by example, I feel like that's sometimes the best way for you to get other youth into civic engagement.
So Mindy, you've studied how election design changes behavior. Sahena mentioned that leading by example might be one way to overcome these barriers. What are some of the other barriers and some changes we can make to increase traditional electoral participation?
Well, I just want to say that hero dynamic, that was really interesting. Thank you. And for what it's worth, I mean, research actually does back, not that you need that, but peer-to-peer contact, peer-to-peer engagement is as it's been defined and as we've understand it now, is the most powerful form of motivation to help a young person participate. It isn't somebody older. It's definitely not a researcher. It's not the media even. It's one-on-one contact, especially for youth that are of similar backgrounds, you know, same community, racial, ethnic background, right, and so forth. So I just wanted to call that out. I always like to tell young people the power. You have the power. You've had the power all along, right? So I covered some of what I think answering your question. I think beyond that, it's, you know, it is, I think, understanding more about where young people are coming from in terms of the alternative forms of engagement and why that matters, right, to them and why it's important and how it should be on an equal footing, if you will, in terms of other forms of engagement and how we can integrate those. If I had a wish in terms of just more research, it's really hard to get data beyond voting is the problem. The census or the current population survey on non-election years actually collects data on civic engagement, but it's got like 2 measures that aren't really, we're being recorded, aren't necessarily relevant really for hardly anybody, right? And so it's difficult, and especially if you want to get into communities, you want to talk to young people or young people of color, because we know that the youth vote is lower than older voters, but It is lower for young people of color, low income. And then if we're talking about the engagement barrier or deficit that I mentioned earlier, when engagement does come, where do the candidates or the issues engage young people? They come into big campuses like this, right? And I used to be at UC Davis, and I'm at USC, and we want all of our students to hear all about the issues, but you almost never see candidates or issue, like people running campaigns or ballot initiatives or whatever, go to community colleges, right? You almost never see them go to community centers and talk to young people who are not in college at a four-year university. So I think just understanding better, certainly the barriers, but understanding how to integrate and think of it as a multi-pronged approach for youth. Think of it as youth power, youth voice, and how what I think of as everyday forms of or mutual aid, right? How that is also very relevant, right, to more civic and political engagement, and how that can be better integrated while still respecting all of it and understanding where people are coming from is really important. So I think I've veered off of your question intentionally, because I think I answered most of it before. And so the problem is that not only is it difficult to get data, but there's also a bias in researching young people, and especially young people that are going to engage in other forms of participation, or young people that are not at four-year universities. Where's a lot of the research? We were talking earlier, right? College, university students, right? And are you engaging students in other forums, right, as well? So I think just recognizing those biases and those difficulties in terms of where we have the deficits in understanding, and that all of it's incredibly important, and that disparities within the youth population need to be better understood and researched and supported, right? Well, that's supported in terms of reversing. That's where I would do a lot of the work. And there's a lot we know about electoral reforms, like automatic voter registration, vote by mail, online voter registration. I've done a lot of the research along with colleagues here in California. We know kind of how that benefits young people, how it doesn't, but the big vast cavern that we don't know a lot about is all the things I just mentioned. And if we understand more about that, I think that is one way to help increase engagement. But of course, it's also the larger system that makes it more difficult for young people to participate, or ignores young people, or leaves them on their own to participate. And that's with all due respect for everything that's happening. There's some powerful work just happening here in the Bay Area that's youth-led or youth supported. So it's all very, very important, but we need to see more, and young people are still overall very underrepresented. So that's where I would emphasize.
And then I wanted to ask Ashley, working with young people, either in college or not in school, how can we work from your perspective to actually increase this amount of engagement?
So the kind of work I do, I support students who are doing community-based work. Usually they're year-long projects. And as we're having this conversation, I was thinking to myself, we have this kind of interesting opportunity. We've got students out, young folks out, serving their communities, meeting new kinds of people, connecting with different parts of the Bay Area that their time at Cal might not have otherwise put in front of them. And then I'm sort of sitting with I wonder whose job it is to then sort of translate with all of these new folks that I have a chance to know, all of these new communities I get to see, how does that actually translate to your electoral practices? And I will say that's not typically what I am to do, but that's a question I'm sitting with. So. And I think that part of what we do at the Public Service Center really well is helping students understand they're in this kind of really interesting long legacy of students who were holding the position that I think, Mindy, you were naming, of both engaging in these alternative, at their time, alternative forms of engagement, and then how that translates to policy or organizing our electorates. And it seems like we're missing something right now, and I'm sitting with what are the words for exactly what's happening? We have people who are deeply passionate, understanding an issue area, and then doesn't necessarily translate to their behavior, which I understand is the question, but I'm thinking in my role specifically, what would happen? Or where do we bridge that gap?
Or people are just also, young people are, you just mentioned it, also just turned off too. Yeah. It's not just about what's coming at them,
right?
Or sometimes it is because of what's coming at them or not coming at them, but they're also turned off, or their families are turned off, again, for very real rational reasons. They feel disconnected from the process. And so why would you be involved or try to figure out a system that's making it hard for you, but also doesn't seem to want you to be involved, or historically hasn't wanted you to be involved?
And certainly hasn't led it to like great material changes in
Yeah.
your, right?
And hasn't led to, that's a big one, hasn't led to outcomes that are really, so, just recognizing that's also part of what we need to understand more of, is we can't just say like transition them to voters, it's like recognizing this and then figuring out like how to have those conversations, which I haven't figured out. Yeah, please.
And then I also wanted to bring Sahena into this. As someone currently in high school, what can we do, or what changes would you make in high school to get people more civically engaged?
I guess the biggest thing at my school, I feel, is we need more adult support. Minnie, you had said something earlier about how some students are just lucky to get that one civics teacher, you know? I feel like I'm definitely the embodiment of that student. My social justice teacher kind of really introduced me to civic engagement and social justice and just all that great stuff, political education. But it's not something accessible to everyone at my school. The academy doesn't have the budget to accept more than 30-something students a year at a school of almost 3,000 students. And so it's a very limited experience. And I feel like we try our best to include as many people at school as possible into our education, into our events in school or outside of school. But it's kind of hard when a lot of adults at my school are very discouraging in a way. We've had incidents in the past where, because our academy is predominantly Black and brown students, we've been called things like quote unquote ghetto and like by grown adults. And I feel like as a student in those classes that may not be in the academy or may not kind of have like a critical consciousness about those types of things, hearing that can kind of, to use your words, make you very turned off to anything that these people may be doing. I feel like the biggest way to kind of get people involved and kind of break down those stereotypes, sometimes really all it takes is a one-on-one conversation. I feel like that's something that's so often forgotten about when it comes to politics regarding young people, is kind of getting close and personal. So often can it feel like even in local elections that these people are so far away, like kind of high and mighty almost, you know? And kind of being able to take yourself off of that pedestal and engage with the people that you're serving and the young people that you will be serving in a few years, you know, that can make all the difference. I feel like I went in many different directions with that question, but yes.
So a thread I'm kind of pulling out of this conversation is that there seems to be an alternative form of participation outside of maybe the electoral forms and the more traditional ones that we've been discussing. I wanted to ask about these more alternative forms of participation in civic life, whether it is more community-based or whether it is youth-led and student-run. If we look beyond all these elections and traditional channels, what forms of these participation are actually moving forward the needle in ways that maybe traditional forms cannot?
If no one else, I feel I kind of answered that a little bit. I feel like getting personal with the community. I feel like we've been seeing a new age when it comes to the way that politics is being treated, at least within my generation. I feel like now it's become so much more than just becoming this big figure, kind of the, I guess, the du jour, you know? Kind of seeming like you're a politician sometimes, or most of the time. I think what people have begun to realize is that we want people in office. We don't want politicians, we want people. And I think just making it known that you are a human being that cares about the people you're about to be serving for the next however long your term is, that's one of the most important things you can do. Showing you're not in it for the money or just kind of like that power, but showing that you actually want to create a change. I think what you were saying, Ashley, about there young people not really seeing any change in their communities, and that kind of being one of the reasons that they don't turn to civic engagement as often. I feel like that's such a huge thing, showing that you're going to make change and then acting on that change once you are in office. That's so important. But
So, Mindy, I remember you mentioned earlier that maybe non-voting forms of participation are really hard to measure. So the things that Sienna are talking about, how can we measure this data roughly and then maybe even use sort of electoral tactics to be able to promote this sort of activism?
Yeah. Well, you don't have a voter file, right? Voter file is a huge data source. It's difficult with surveys because we're talking about small, usually community to community, right? Different amazing programs, but they're often not across big populations where a survey would work. Doesn't mean you can't do surveys, but at least not like representative samples and things. Really, it's alternative methods or mixed methods. So at least for me, when I've tried to understand more about communities that are difficult in terms of measuring in traditional ways, like because of population size, like we'll do, believe it or not, focus groups. Totally legitimate way to do that. Focus groups with young people are a blast to do. They're fantastic, right? We'll do in-depth interviews. We'll do content analysis. We'll do observations. And the problem is that, or at least a problem can be that academic journals and fellow kind of academics that are in the space of youth engagement that study it, we generally also have a bias about anything that isn't generalizable. And so you kind of have to overcome some of that as well. And so sometimes the research will not get as much play in academic circles, but it's still really important. And so like with my research center, we get out our research, sorry about that. We disseminate it as widely as possible to groups, to policymakers, to decision makers, thought leaders, and hopefully to young people as much on the ground, or at least that are present in groups. And we don't worry about the academic journals so much. I know I'm saying that on UC Berkeley campus. I'm so sorry. Because if you chase that, it's going to limit your research questions. It's going to limit your methodology, right? And so I run an applied research center, and the importance of that. So it's not about my center, but to answer your question, more research like that. And there are a lot of great centers across the country, and think tanks and academics that do seek to answer questions that are relevant to underrepresented groups, period, relevant to young people specifically. But you have to engage in alternative methods often and make a case for why that research is, where academics may not pay as much attention to it, make sure that you are disseminating as widely as possible, making the relationships for policymakers and others to understand it, so that way there is a positive impact from that work that can help inform and help people to better understand all the questions that we're interested in, right? Yeah.
On that note, I want to move on to a few audience questions. So related for Sienna and Ashley, what are some examples of alternative forms of civic engagement that Gen Z has taken on?
You should start.
Okay. Well, within the Social Justice Academy of San Leandro, we kind of are very limited, given that we can't vote ourselves and our, I guess, target audience can't really vote either. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll kind of try to speak to the families, not really directly, but we'll create voting guides on our Instagram, or we will hold actions outside of our school during pickup time. So when we're speaking, adults that are driving by or driving through the little roundabout circle can hear what we're talking about. And a lot of the times, even though sometimes it can kind of feel like we're speaking to the wind, it actually does end up getting a lot of families interested. And I've even heard of a student having a conversation with their family because they heard what we were talking about while they were driving through. Or I guess some other things, just kind of trying to introduce students to what civic engagement can look like when they are older. We've taken field trips to city council meetings, school board meetings. Even currently, we've been working very closely with the Justice for Stephen Taylor campaign in San Leandro for a police brutality victim. And recently we've taken a lot of, I guess, trips to the Alameda County Courthouse to speak, or not to speak, to watch closely with what's going on. It's gotten a lot of my peers very interested in law. Personally, I get too emotional for law. I know I would cry while I'm speaking, especially if it's very close to my heart. But it always makes me very happy to see my friends and my fellow classmates who do get very interested in law and in politics and all these different things. So just kind of introducing students to a world that they very likely may not have been encouraged to research more into previously because of kind of what we were saying earlier, all these barriers that are put up against them, whether it's because of their age or because of their background, their gender, etc.
Ashley?
Yeah. So I'll say, I mean, a lot of the things our students are doing are, they're tutoring kids in after-school programs, they're working with transitional age youth and foster care programs, they're feeding their neighbors, which are wonderful things, and I'm so glad they spend so much time doing that. But I think the thing that really kind of catches my attention about this particular group of students is how creative and interested they are in trying to meet the needs of the folks they're meeting. I had a chance to visit one of the high schools that our students work with, and the students are serving as peer counselors for high school students going through all sorts of things, and the students have created their own intake system that doesn't feel at all like an intake system. They are the kind of questions that they understand to ask, the ways in which they're remembering, oh, when I was a kid, my mom would yell at me when I was asking about FAFSA stuff, and I didn't realize that she was really stressed out. So learning how to translate that to their peers by really learning how to be with their own experiences or showing up for gaps they didn't have, I think has been really cool. But they are, the students in our programs are all over the Bay Area doing lots and lots of interesting things, and I feel like I'm learning about a lot of what's happening and what's moving in the Bay through the different things they're interested in. So some of it's super traditional, which I appreciate, and some of it is different and interesting. And I think right now there's some sort of youth feedback board being organized at a transition age youth housing shelter, which I think is different and new. And so it's kind of cool just to watch people kind of find a context where some work exists and still find a way to make it special and offer something new.
The next question I have here is for Sahena and Dr. Romero. How do we combat the narrative that younger people shouldn't be taken seriously in politics?
Okay. I think to combat that narrative. Actually, would you like to take this one first? Because I got to think about it for a second.
Oh, okay.
That's a great question.
It's a great question, but it's a hard question. So I know why you needed to think. I need to think too. No, I think it's just for honestly forums like this, but also forums not like this, right? I think it's first helping young people to, through hopefully peers, understand the reasons why we see lower participation, understand that apathy narrative, the kind of the impact that has, whether a young person wants to get involved politically, civically, or in alternative forms of civic engagement. The more that they're armed with kind of the larger picture of where the barriers are and where the societal pressures are and how young people are dismissed and what, all of that we've been talking about today, I think it's going to take young people pushing back themselves ultimately, right? With their own parents that might might dismiss them being involved. It happens a lot. I hear from students a lot. My mom told me not to register because she didn't want me to get jury duty or whatever it is, or my parents don't really think I should vote, or because they think I need to get out of school and pay taxes first or something, or whatever, right? I'm picking on parents right now, but it comes from all sorts of different directions. So I think ultimately young people have to push back themselves, but more awareness in general. I do a lot of work with the media, and whenever I get a media interview that's specific to young people, it's always just before an election, there's a flurry, you've seen them, flurry of articles online, wherever, and right after the election. But before, it's is this the election that young people are going to make a difference? Within 2 days, maybe the next day, it's a whole bunch of articles that are what happened in this election? It was young people. They screwed it up, apathetic, whatever, right? all the time. I've been doing this for 15, 20 years. And I just push back. I try to keep that reporter online on the phone or wherever it is, and say, because I can just tell by the first, even well-meaning, well-intentioned reporters that are not trying to do anything that's hurtful or negative to young people, but you can tell by the first question or two, the story is going to be somehow, in some form, subtly, usually, sometimes not, but it's going to be blaming young people. And so you keep them on the, keep them on the line, and you explain, and you talk through, okay, don't just use these numbers, at least let me tell you why these numbers are these numbers, right? And so working through the media is really, really important. And then hopefully working through other groups and, as well, that are out there thinking they're supporting young people, but helping them to make sure that they have the information and the data and all that sort of thing. So I think that's one way to answer your question. Most powerful would be young people themselves. But as already noted, there's also, young people are busy and working and going to school or whatever it is. And without that support, so pre-school, pre-college, or working in the real world, right? Whatever, well, college is the real world too, but you know what I mean, working without going to school, forgive me. Before you graduate, basically, there needs to be more support, honest conversations about the barriers that are at play for young people. It can't be rah-rah, it's your civic duty. So you either don't get great civics, or you get rah-rah, do it because it's your civic duty, and that just goes, understandably, right past, not that they can't, it's just not relevant, it doesn't resonate. So instead, let's meet people the young people where they're at, and have honest conversations about the barriers and the reasons and places where they want to get involved. Just more of that would be so important. And as I've worked with young people, it's that kind of, sometimes that moment, where they realize that's, if you understand the kind of the barriers that are in play and the kind of the suppression that young people are really experiencing, then it's kind of, oh, I don't want my vote to be taken from me. I don't want, and so let me figure out how I can get involved given the barriers that are in play for me. Yeah.
Sahana?
Yes.
Now, did I give you long enough?
Yes, that
Okay,
was
good.
perfect. Thank you.
My long-windedness can come in handy.
I think you put it brilliantly. I feel like the humanization of young people is such an important thing. I think you kind of mentioning how the lens isn't really focused on young people until right before an election. And I think we notice that, kind of tokenization in a way, and I think kind of trying to make it a point that even before all the cameras turn on, even before all the pressure is applied, you're going to care about young people regardless. It's we notice, that's literally the simplest way I can put it. Actually doing the work to engage with the young people. I feel like I've been just saying this all night because I just find it so important, to show people that you care. If you're just kind of it's one rally with young people around, and then for the rest of your campaign, it's just we're in the background, no one's really going to take you that seriously. And then that could lead to a lot of young people not wanting to vote because it's well, neither of these candidates have really spoken towards anything I care about. None of them have a serious stance about it or anything like that. So yeah, just humanizing us, recognizing us, once I get a little bit older, as real valid voters and stuff like that. That's going to be the key part into getting more of us to actually be out there and supporting your cause,
Got it. So I have one final audience question for tonight. What resources would you recommend for the youth who want to become more civically engaged, or for adults who want to support them in doing so? And I want to start with Ashley.
What resources?
What resources?
Well, I think on this campus, please come to the Public Service Center. We have so many things we can offer. And I think generally, I used to, it's sort of tangential, but I used to run this really tiny philanthropy that, we gave little small grants, but there's so much happening. There's so much you can do. And so I think, for myself, I think all the time, I don't, what is a I don't know. In my own home, like I hate taking out the trash. I'm not going to go volunteer at like a compost farm, right? There are plenty of interesting things to do on the things that are like joyful and interesting to you. And I think so much when we think about like what to do, how to get involved. You asked me for resources. I'm talking at you, but just to say, like, do you find things that you enjoy and like figure out a way to translate that. Ways you can find that. Like there are so many websites you can find on Idealist, you can look at Blue Heart Bay Area, you can go to Hands On Bay Area. There are 8,000 different ways you can involve or get involved. And then there's also just looking for like what are your interests and your natural opportunities to connect, and then deepening from there. There's so like I mean, I wish I could share the resource we compile for students, but in any given weekend, there are like 10 to 15 family-friendly events that you could find that I actually just comb on the internet to look for interesting things for students to do. If there's an organization that does something that I think is a little bit interesting, not to clutter my inbox, I'll just join their newsletter because ultimately it'll lead me to one thing or the other. So just being curious, available, and like deciding how much time do I have to commit and then making the right size commitment. There's a resource.
Sahana?
Well, I'll take this as an opportunity to plug my organization. The Social Justice Academy of San Leandro, public schools and their organizations could always use any donations or even beyond donations, just engagement. You can follow our Instagram, Social Justice Academy of SL. I'm so sorry, that's my phone. But we're a very great organization of, it's very youth-led, ethnic studies and social justice focused. I feel like without this academy, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to y'all today. It's introduced me and so many other students in the past almost 2 decades now. It's introduced us to civic engagement, political education, just all these different things that have opened our eyes to so much. Youth versus the Apocalypse, I'm so sorry. Environmental justice organization, completely youth-led, youth-supported. We do a lot of work around environmental justice and kind of focusing more on how Black and brown youth are kind of, environmental justice has been a very whitewashed kind of sector of social justice for such a long time. And it's so important to recognize that a lot of the effects of climate change, it's not going to hit affluent, whiter areas first. It's going to hit places where factories are very close by, which is usually predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. It's going to hit the people that have to walk to school every day. It's going to hit the people that take public transportation, all that different kind of stuff. So supporting us in being able to put the power back into the youth's hands, since ultimately we're going to feel most of the effects at the end of the day, And then also, I really like what you said about just kind of looking into the things you enjoy. Usually when I get very hyper-focused on things I enjoy, it takes me down rabbit holes. Go down your own rabbit hole. You'll eventually find lots of organizations to help support, and I'm sure they'll be so grateful.
Mindy?
I think that was really well said, so I'm going to let that be the last word.
And with that, I'd like to give one final thank you to all of our panelists tonight. And then I'll pass it back to Kylie.
Of course. Thank you so much to our speakers and our moderator for a thoughtful and super engaging discussion tonight. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors for making this event possible. This evening reminded us that even though young people remain underrepresented in many of our political systems, they're anything but disengaged. Across campuses and communities, we continue to build new civic infrastructure grounded in care, collaboration, and solidarity. Before we officially close, I want to invite everyone to stay, share some food, and continue the conversation. We had a lot of good audience questions that we weren't able to answer, so just be respectful of our speakers' time, but if they are available and willing, I'm sure that they would love to answer those questions for you. So yeah, stay, get some more cheese and crackers, and I'm very, very honored to have our speakers with us today. Thank you guys so much.